Welcome to all.
Good afternoon. Most of you probably know me, having given several presentations here, including this one a little over 5 years ago. This one's updated now, and I've got somewhat of a background in satellite design, but mostly I was involved in the antenna design and ground stations for various satellites, but I was always in on the satellite design too for the military. We'll get to that a little bit later on. We're going to talk about satellites and how they impact us in our daily life. All right, let me try this. Where's the computer? Here?
Hold it down. Push it again.
Nope. May have to go back to slideshow. There we go. Is that you or me?
I did that.
No, I'm out of action. So,
Okay.
All right. This is an overview of what we're going to talk about today. History of satellites, how they work, frequency bands, orbit types. You're going to know more about satellites and the technical part of it than you ever wanted to know. We'll spend a little more time on GPS, weather satellites, some remote sensing, communications, and then the last part of it is, quote, spy satellites, which is always, people are really interested in that part of the talk, so we'll cover that at the end next, Dick. This is the early history of satellites. First ones up were the Sputniks, and then rapidly after that, I'm not going to go down and go through those. The ones that are really significant down there that we'll talk about later on are the Mir space station, which then turned into the International Space Station, and then the Hubble Telescope, and you can see that those have been up there now for 30 years. So that's pretty ancient equipment, a lot of those things, when you think about the advances that have been made in the last 30 years. Next. This is a little bit of an overview of how satellites work. Back up one. I think we might have skipped one. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Back up one more. Okay, now you can go forward. I thought we skipped one here. This is kind of a breakout of the operational satellites. Of course, this is not ever accurate, even day to day. It changes all the time. But you can see a basic idea here of the split in function between the satellites. And by and large, the largest amount by far is communication satellites, and you'll see that as we go through the presentation. And they're in various orbits depending on the use and the location that they serve. You can see there's a pretty good amount of military and surveillance satellites, 7%. That's an awful high number. That's a big percentage where you have 7%. And the other, we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along through there. And those are mostly research satellites that are put up by either educational institutions or other small governments who piggyback on the main payload of other satellite systems and other rockets. Thanks, Jim. Okay, the basic idea, and this is a thing, is there's two real components to every satellite, and you have the satellite itself after it's put into orbit. We're not going to talk about the launch systems and how these satellites get into orbit. Once they get into orbit, then you have the satellite itself, and you always have a ground station, which controls the satellite. It sends messages up and down to the satellite and receives transmissions back. And then the other term that you hear all the time about satellites is their footprint. And that's very, very important when we talk about what satellites can be effective, what orbits you have to use, and what the useful range or utility of the various satellites are, it's all dependent on their footprint on the Earth's surface. This is what a ground control station looks like. And those are some big dishes there. And the bigger the dish, the more the power. And that's why they are like this. And the more sensitive they are so that they can receive faint signals. And so this is a typical satellite control ground station, what they look like. Orbits. I'm not going to go too deeply into orbits, but it's important that you know that there are a variety of orbits and they're used for dramatically different things. The most commonly known one is the geostationary, the blue one there that's kind of angled to the right. That's at about 23,000 miles from Earth. And that's where you saw those communication satellites that are roughly 60%. Probably 90% of the communication satellites are in that orbit, in the geostationary orbit. Also in that orbit are weather satellites, television satellites, and other things because they want a constant footprint over the ground. They don't want that footprint to move. They want it to stay, for instance, over the United States, or you may want to stay over Southern Africa or something. That dictates where in that ring you put the satellite. The communications satellites in that orbit, and then you have these highly elliptical orbits. We're going to talk a little bit more about those, and you use those when you can't see the footprint. When you can't see the part of the Earth that you might want to reach, then you need a different orbit. And a highly elliptical orbit then allows you to see a much broader span of the Earth, a much larger footprint. The problem is you can see it when the satellite is up high at the top of its orbit, but then when it's at the bottom, you can't see anything because it's too close and it's moving too fast. It moves very fast at the bottom of the orbit relative to the Earth and very, very slowly at the top of its orbit. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that. Polar orbits, most geostationary orbits you can't see above about 80 degrees latitude. So you have polar orbits. Very difficult to maintain, takes a lot of fuel to do that. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about the Hubble Telescope. Been around since 1990. One of the most well-known satellites out there. A lot of people recognize the name and thing. It's in LEO, low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit in this case can be, this one, it says 375 miles. It does vary. They move it up and down, distance from the Earth. They'll change the orbit shape when they want it to look in a different place. It gets its power from a solar array, which almost all the satellites do. There are some other forms of power generation. And these are the terms: the orbit time, 100 minutes. That's pretty fast. It says concerns are the orbit decay from gravity and solar output, which means you constantly have to be adjusting the orbit to keep it in the orbit track you want, which takes fuel. So what do we do then? It runs out of fuel. You can't carry an unlimited supply of fuel. So there have been several resupply missions to the Hubble using the space shuttle. And so we've had extravehicular activity at the Hubble to replenish its power supply so that it can stay active. And so that's the only way this satellite can stay active for 30 years is the fact.
Thrusters.
Yes, yeah, it's got thrusters, and they use gas, expanded gas thrusters. In this case, it doesn't take much. That's the thing about space. The nice thing about space, doesn't take much to get, and you only want an extremely slow, small amount because you have to stop it too. Once you start it moving, there's no drag, there's no atmosphere. So once you start it moving, you've got to stop it as well where you want to stop it. So it's always a double use of fuel every time you want to do something with it. And again, the important thing here is there's been several service missions to keep this active. Some of the most fascinating photos that I've ever seen around have come from the Hubble. These are nebula, space dust, essentially, out there, either from stars that have blown up or from newly forming stars. But they make some amazing pictures. And pictures like this are not possible at all from the Earth. We can't get them. Here's some more. This one in the lower right-hand corner, I don't remember how many years ago, a few years ago, won the top photo. They have a photo competition, National Geographic, and that photo won it for the year. That was the winning photo for the year, National Geographic. Next, please. Another one that most people have heard of is the International Space Station. This is a modular thing, and it's made up of components from Russia, the United States, and small components from several other countries. There are 5 countries that participate in the International Space Station. It's been continuously occupied for 20 years. Matter of fact, we're just changing over right now. We're changing over crews on the International, so they had 3 that just docked recently, and there'll be 3 more come down from up there. And the ones that are going up are going to be on board for 6 months. That's a long time hanging out in the International. This is the largest man-made artificial object in orbit around the Sun. There's a lot of hazards especially to the low Earth orbit satellites. There's a lot of hazards out there that you have to take into account when you're designing your satellite, and even after you have it in orbit, things that can essentially take it out of commission in a single act. On the top left, you see high energy protons and cosmic rays. We don't even think about those because those are filtered out essentially by our atmosphere. There are some that are not. Gamma rays will go all the way through the Earth from the Sun. But most of them are filtered out by atmosphere, not so in these satellites. And what happens there is the electronics are really sensitive. These things impact the electronics on board. These electronic particles, very dangerous. They're high energy electrons, same thing. And they impact the solar arrays from the radiation standpoint. And then you see the one at the very bottom there, electronics degrade due to radiation dose, and that's from the transmission. This is probably the most dangerous part to any satellite out there, is space debris, and particularly, once again, low Earth orbits, because that's where it's the most dense. And what you're looking at here is a representation. Back one. Oop, going the wrong way. There we go. Oop, forward one. There we go. Uh-oh, hope that wasn't the computer. This picture here shows a representation of items that are tracked. These are by the various space agencies that are cooperating. They track 500,000 pieces of debris. Every day, all day long, 24 hours a day, they're tracking them. So to see where they're at so that we can actually maneuver satellites and try to avoid these pieces. Now, there's 2 ways to protect your satellite, and that's shielding, which is just exactly what it sounds, usually some sort of a metal or a film, although it can be glass. It's possible to shield with glass out there. And then the second one is maneuver. But there's a lot of dangerous things out there. what you see is these micro debris impact things. This is the one on the top left there is from what impact on the shuttle window. And that's from a piece that's microns in size. In other words, we can't even see the piece without a microscope that caused that damage when it hit the space shuttle's wind. So you can't maneuver to avoid those because you can't see them and you can't track them and you don't know what. So you have to do shielding for these small items like this, these small things, and every satellite just about gets hit every day. So when you imagine one that's been up there 30 years, imagine what the surface of that satellite actually looks like. Let me do that. Next, please. Probably the most well-known orbit in everyone, we talked a little earlier, is geosynchronous or geostationary. And there's probably a subtle enough difference. We're not going to talk about that exactly. But what it means is you put the satellite in orbit so that it will stay exactly over the one spot in Earth you want it to see. And then it focuses on there. And that distance is 22,000 some miles out. It's roughly, I say 23,000 because it's a lot easier to remember on the thing. And what you do is it's very closely controlled. Every individual slot in that ring is controlled. You don't just put a satellite up. You've got to get permission, have a license, and be authorized to put a satellite into geosynchronous orbit. From the ground, these satellites look like a star or a thing if you are big enough to see, or if the sun catches them or another thing just right, it does not appear to move. It will stay in a fixed place in the sky. And they cover about 40% of the planet per satellite. Okay, that doesn't sound like much, but it's a real problem because sometimes when you're broadcasting things, you don't want them to cover 40% of the Earth. You want them to only cover 10% because you don't want to transmit your television signal into a place that's not paying for it. So you have to figure out how to do that part of it from this altitude. Next year. Communication, weather are the two main uses for geostationary. They say that satellites there are 10 to 15 years, but they're getting more life out of them in many cases than they thought. We have many up there that are 25 years old and still doing just fine. That's a problem because they're doing okay, but they're sitting in a slot. And everybody wants those slots, especially over the US and Europe. Those are the two biggest users of satellite communication and weather, those two population areas on the Earth, and now China and South Asia. Go ahead.
How far apart are the slots?
I'll show you in a minute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Thousands of miles?
No,
okay.
No. Much closer than you would think. They don't require coverage of the north and southernmost regions because they're in order to be geosynchronous, they have to be positioned over the equator when you do that. Now, these satellites Okay. These satellites are predominant. They can easily see all of the United States. They can easily see almost all of South America when they do that. The same thing with Asia and Europe. They typically go, and I don't know if I have it on one of these slides, they typically go to about 80 degrees north or south latitude. That's how far they can see. But there's still a lot of people and a lot of places above and below those 20-degree points that you can't reach. So you need a different orbit to get there. You can't get there from G, and that's hence the polar orbits and the Molnias. We're going to talk about those in a little bit too. Every 4 to 8 degrees. So a degree is roughly 50 miles. So you're thinking somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 miles apart. That's not very far in the big scheme of things out there.
22,000 miles.
At 22,000 miles out, when you're that close together, and you think of how big, I should do that. I didn't figure it out, but figure out what that circumference is at 23,000 miles from Earth. What's the circumference of that circle? How many, it's huge. There's about 300 in orbit. This is 3 or 4 year old information. So I'm not exactly sure how many are up there right now. But one of the, go ahead. Here's the advantages and disadvantages of the geostationary orbits. Images can always be displayed. They're constant. They're always focusing down. Television broadcasts are not interrupted because it sits there and doesn't move. And so you can do that. And they can track events 24 hours a day. And things like hurricanes, they have a field of view big enough to see everything at once. When you're up that high, you can see that whole space all at one time. The problem you've got here, as you see, is it takes longer for the signal to get to Earth and back to the satellite. That doesn't sound like far by space terms, but it is, which means when you're doing television, you have to account for that delay. And so there's got to be some spectacular computer power going on to make that image smooth, simultaneous, and correct because of the transmission up and down from this satellite, because it's not stored on the satellite. The images are not stored on the satellite, they just go through. And they're called transponders, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. It's even more difficult because of in telephone conversations. And you can remember if you've ever made international calls, how you get the echo and you sound like you're in a cave sometimes. That's because the satellite is up there and they haven't resolved that as well as they could, that time lag. So that's how you get that sound. And the same thing, you can't work the northern and southernmost climates. So if you can't do that, for instance, if you're in Siberia or Antarctica, or the southern regions of those, or in northern Scandinavia, even Iceland's getting close up there, how do you get continuous coverage? Well, you use this orbit that's called a Molniya orbit after the Russians who named it. And it's a very highly elliptical orbit. And so its field of view stays relatively constant when it's at the top of its orbit, and it's moving very slowly up there. So it has a long, what we call dwell time. So you can get almost 12 hours of coverage out of one satellite. So for 24 hours coverage, you need 2 satellites. And you'll have just about 24 hours guaranteed coverage because it's up there and its dwell time is so long that it can look down and do this. But once again, now it can't see down into the lower regions below about 25 degrees. So it's only useful for these northern and southernmost regions. GPS, I think probably everyone's heard of GPS. It's in everything. Cell phones, cars, computers, every imaginable thing out there. Almost all the rail cars now have GPS transmitters, so they can track them on the thing. It's a constellation. That's another term that you hear in satellites all the time. If you have more than one, it's a constellation, and you have specifically designed where those satellites are going to be at any given time. 16 of these are operational and 8 are backups and they launch them just about every year. They're launching a new satellite, because they'll launch one up, kick one out. Same thing. They have to have them in these exact slots in these exact orbits. And so they don't want to leave a satellite in there where it could possibly fail, even though they have spares. So they're constantly replenishing them. And they get more and more sophisticated every launch, every year. This is one satellite system that I worked on from the very beginning. From the time we were designing it until it went operational, I was pretty heavily involved in this system. It works because each of the satellites is essentially a really good clock. It's an atomic clock. It's super, super, super accurate. And because of that, it can tell where it's at all the time. And because it can tell where it's at, if you have another point of reference, it can tell where that point's at. Now, there's an error in there when you have only one satellite and one point. You get a considerable amount of error. 2 satellites, less error. 3 satellites, even less error. So most of the satellite systems uses we have, you see, they want you to see, they call it, want you to see 3 satellites. If it's your cell phone, your car, if you happen to be a surveyor and using survey equipment, they want you to see 3 satellites, and they would prefer it if you can see 4. That'll give you the thing. Now, I can't remember the exact year, but it was only 2 or 3 years ago, maybe a little longer, where there was a big brouhaha because the military pushed these signals off, so they were not as accurate as the satellites can do, because they didn't want everybody to have 3-foot accuracy. They only wanted people to have 10-foot accuracy, because they didn't want enemies to be able to use the system for weapons. And there was a big thrash in the United States, and they changed it, and now every user gets full system accuracy, which is essentially 30 centimeters, which is, something like 10, 12 inches. You can get it down to 10, with 4 satellites and clear reception, you can get down to 10 or 12 inches. That's not accurate enough for many things. So surveyors, for instance, use a thing called differential GPS, where they buy 2 transmitters, set them on stakes distance apart. They transmit to the satellites and to each other. So they get double triangulation, and they can get down to something under a ½ an inch of accuracy. And that's 3-dimensional accuracy. So same thing is true in the vertical. And do that. It's absolutely in everything, and one of the most valuable systems probably ever designed was a GPS. Everybody uses it. Timing, it's used for business transactions, power distribution. They use it to track sharks. They put tags on everything now and track them. They have GPS things. One of the things I worked on back right after I retired was systems to track trucks and rail cars for a company I was working for that wanted to sell those systems to the rail companies and to truck lines in order to track them 24 hours a day. Now that's normal to be able to do that. Geocaching is one of my favorite. Anybody ever geocached in here? It's what it is you take your GPS handheld receiver, you go online, it'll tell you where a geocache is. There's a lot of them in Alpena. And you now go off and hunt and find it, and it'll be hidden somewhere, and your GPS will get you within a few feet of it, and you still may not find it. But it's a big pastime now. People do that all over the world to go out and try to find these hidden treasures in geocaching. It's guaranteed accurate to 7.8 meters. That's the old system before they turned it loose and gave the full accuracy. 10 centimeters accuracy, that's the differential. Survey augmented 20 millimeters, whatever. That's pretty darn small. Weather satellites. There's a lot of weather satellites up there from various different countries because they have different needs and desires for the type of output they want from the weather systems. So it's typically, these are placed, not always, but typically they're in geostationary orbit. It says it takes the satellite 24 hours to orbit the Earth once, but it's not really, like we said, it's not really moving. It's staying stationary over the top. So it is orbiting the Earth, but it's kind of a weird way that they phrase that. There are some polar orbiting satellites because we, all of us in the world, want to know what's happening in the weather over the poles because that impacts the weather everywhere else out there. So there are some that are polar orbiting, and these are still images typically that they take about every minute. They take it. That's another problem is that's a lot of bandwidth to transmit a picture that big every minute. So a lot of communications involved there too. This is what a satellite looks like, a weather satellite. It's huge. You can see the man on the platform there working on it. Probably more than half the weight of this satellite is fuel in there, so that it can continuously be positioned and maintained in position over its useful life. Those little gold things you see sticking out are transponders that help them communicate with ground stations. Doesn't have to be one, it can be 50 all around the Earth where they transmit the information back down. Once again, we now take this for granted. We just turn on the weather on our cell phone and get the radar. Well, 90% of it is coming from these satellites. This is, it doesn't show the exact location. This is more to show you the number of weather satellites out there and the various users. And the interesting thing here is they are certainly not all US. They are everybody has a weather satellite. There's really only 2 or 3 people countries launching satellites, but there are many, many countries using satellites, particularly these weather satellites. They have all kinds of spectrum analysis on the satellites. The most common one that we see all the time is visual. This is, of course, a hurricane image in the visual light spectrum. And this is what it looks like in infrared. And you get precipitation analysis here, and you get density of precipitation based on an inverse temperature. This is a damage track of a storm, and you can see how it moved through and how the area underneath the center part of the storm was destroyed. I think this is really an interesting shot. All of the colors are added artificially to represent things that are important to meteorologists. So the meteorologists all get together, decide what they want to have impact of this display, and they choose the colors so that it means something to them. Remote sensing is kind of a interest. It's a little bit of a conglomeration of a reconnaissance satellite and a weather satellite kind of, and it has all kinds of sensors on board that are also visual, infrared, radiometry, all kinds of various sensors in order to study the Earth. Okay, Jude. It's all about sensing different things on the planet, of course, without making any physical contact with it. And the interesting thing about this is you can study somebody else's stuff without entering their borders or going across their property. And so this is another reason that these are very, very useful to a lot of countries. These are just an example of the various products, and these are all different frequency spectrums. You've got visual light, infrared light, artificially generated foliage in the lower right. These are artificially generated to try to depict foliage. And then here we have the storm tracks. And once again, those are infrared. This is deforestation in Brazil, and this is part of what they use the remote sensing for, because they can track huge areas of land over a period of time and see the changes, and you can see there how much forest was destroyed in that period of time. And so this is a very typical usage for remote sensing. And these are the areas, we won't go through each one, but even small communities like Alpena often use the products of these remote sensing satellites, and they pay for them, of course. And this is what the images would look like. You can buy these now online for like $10. Individuals can go online and buy it if you know what you want. One of the highest usage areas is agriculture. And this shows you crop usage. And this is water. And even mineral exploration. And they can actually, because each one makes a different signature, they can actually determine what the mineral mix is. I find that to be pretty amazing.
What are they sensing? Obviously.
I'm not sure.
You know?
Dick.
Okay, I'm just curious. They must.
I don't know how they can do that, but I suspect it's the
ultraviolet from the sun.
It could be
like
the
that.
reflection that they give off is everything reflects the different frequency spectrum of light. And I suspect that they can narrow it down enough to say if the light is in this range, it's this material. This is, again, probably the biggest use. We've talked about a lot of this already. One of the key things there is scalability, third one up from the bottom. What that means is, as opposed to land-based architecture, when you have communication satellites, once you get your satellite in orbit, then all you need is a cell phone. This is the sum total of your extra infrastructure on the thing. And that means huge scalability. One satellite, 500,000 users possible. That's what they mean by scalability. Next, please. Again, they're geosynchronous. Next. There's your slide, Dick. And you can see here that there are some places where there are no satellites. And yeah, they're over the middle of Pacific Ocean, over the middle of the thing. There are nobody wants to pay to have a satellite there. And then yet you see the ones where there are 5 or 6 satellites in a slot. Remember we talked about what those slots are. Now there's 6 satellites in that slot. So somebody's got to take responsibility for keeping those 6 satellites apart in there. And it's typically the US, as you can see where they're pointing on the globe and where the thing. So that's the US's problem. Their satellites, their problem. They've got to maintain the separation. Next, please. This is what a communication satellite looks like. Now this is where I would, let's see if this thing works. Nope.
The top pointer should work. Hold the very top button.
There we go. Yeah, this is one where I can use a pointer because this, you can see once again the size of these things. They are huge. And each one of these dishes here are running around is probably owned by a different company. Communication, AT&T, Verizon, somebody, whoever. And it could be CNN. And then each one of those little spikes or little nubs that you see on each one of those dishes is focused on a specific spot on the ground. In other words, it's focused on the Midwest. It's focused on Chicago. It's focused because those are separate markets and they transmit totally different things to those 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 markets. And so it's really a complicated piece of equipment. Now, there's small communication satellites too, and these are relatively recent. They were just starting when I was in the satellite business. Now they're actually operational. The two here we're going to talk about, and Dick, Starlink is the one you wanted to talk about with Elon Musk, but Iridium has been around as a concept since I was beginning this. Next, please. Iridium has 66 satellites in its constellation. Low Earth satellites, low Earth orbit. That's their coverage, which is the whole Earth. They cover 100% of the Earth because these satellites all communicate with each other. So they can maintain and do the things, and if you buy a phone from them, you see in the upper left corner there, there's a picture of a typical Iridium satellite phone. Now, every company that makes phones makes satellite phones also. And so they come in all shapes, sizes, but that's typically what they look like, and they all typically have a big antenna like that. Because these satellites have no power because they're small. So you need a big sensitive antenna to be able to get the signal from the satellite. I put up some of the typical costs there. These are current right now, today. You can do a monthly plan, which gives you 10 minutes of talk time per month. That's $55. And also that includes 10 texts. Or you can spend $115 and you get 200 minutes of talk and 200 texts. That's pretty reasonable. That's pretty reasonable to go anywhere in the world. Turn on your phone and you will guarantee you will have a signal and you will have contact. Okay, so businesses like this, and they use it a lot. Now, this is the current technology, and this is the concept from Elon Musk, from SpaceX. That's his launch system that he has developed. And he's come up with this idea called Starlink. And it's mainly designed to improve internet connectivity over the entire world, because he sees a $1 trillion market for improved internet. Now, and everybody says, well, everybody's got internet now. You can call up on a cell phone. There are a lot of areas of the world you can't, but the signal is unreliable, even around here. This guarantees reliability, assuming their satellites actually work. They came out with a proposal in 2015 to do 4,000 satellites. That's a lot of satellites. Now they've upped that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, to 12,000. The satellites look like this thing in the lower left here. Right here, that's the satellite. Flat plate, it's about this high, maybe 4 or 5 feet high, and then it's got a solar array that's about 1.5 times the length of the plate that expands when it puts into orbit. This part here, that's 25 satellites stacked in a big pile. That's how they launch them. They can launch 25 to 40 satellites at a time. That's an amazing feat to be able to do that. Since they came up with this concept, they now have 715 satellites in orbit. That's a lot of satellites, but not anywhere near 4,000. They've got some problems. They've got micro-impact shielding. Remember, we talked about that. They use a thing called krypton ion propulsion. That sounds like Isaac Asimov and sci-fi and all these kinds of things, because ion propulsion was a big thing in early sci-fi, and it actually works. And they use krypton gas, and they let it out 1 ion at a time. And that's enough to move the satellite. Pretty amazing what they can do. They have what they call autonomous avoidance, which means these satellites all talk to each other too, and they are on a continuous feed from Cheyenne Mountain, where we talked about tracking all these debris and all the satellites. They also track all the satellites that are up there. It's fed automatically into these satellites. They get the total feed every day. They move automatically. Nobody has to intervene. That's pretty amazing that they can do that. It is not operational. Okay, that's the thing about Starlink. It's still a concept, but they're putting satellites up there and they're trying to get it going. They're going to try to do their first operational test this month, just as a test of the system. So we should hear something soon, whether it works or not. Satellite frequency, who cares about this crap? Well, it just has to do with the size of those satellites. You know, the bigger your frequency, lower your frequency bands, the more throughput you have, the more power you need. The terrestrial dish size here, you can remember we saw that typical ground station and all the different dish sizes that were there on that picture. And the reason for that is all the different frequencies go into that satellite. You've got low frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies. You need a different dish for each frequency in order to be able to communicate. The problem with and you can move a lot of things on these high frequency things, but like a lot of television signals, they're very susceptible to jamming and rain and wind. So when the signals are in the high frequency range, you get a lot of interference. Okay? You get a high resolution radar images in X band. Well, we're going to talk about radar here in a minute when we talk about military satellites, and they're in X band. But once again, they're really, really sensitive to rain or clouds or any kind of atmospheric deviation. So that's a little bit of a trouble when you're trying to use X band radar. So again, all susceptible to this. Now they overcome that. Now they've been able to overcome it in the last few years because the computers are so much faster on this end now. They can actually filter out the rain in the signal coming down. The computers are smart enough to do that. So they're doing a lot better. All right, now the part that people a lot of times are curious about and do these things. This is the other part that I worked in a lot, is reconnaissance satellites, designing reconnaissance satellites. When I first started in the satellite business, these are the different ints. Intelligence, so image intelligence, signals intelligence, electronic and communications intelligence. And when I first started in the business, the word communications intelligence was classified. That word. That's how stupid it was, you know, back then. This is 50 years ago or 40 years ago. But we also have in reconnaissance satellites early warning. That's ballistic missile early warning satellites. Those are all infrared. And what they do is they spot rocket signatures. Anybody tries to launch a rocket anywhere in the world, we see it. Guaranteed. We will not miss a rocket launch anywhere in the world. That's that satellite system. Measurement and signature intelligence, the same thing, but it's electronic. Anybody turns on a radar anywhere in the world, if we want to know about it, we'll collect all their stuff and figure out how they're doing it. What they think. That's the signature. And then nuclear explosion detection, that's a whole different set of sensors on the satellite. This is the boys that do that stuff, that do each one of those ints that you see out there. CIA, that's the spies, that's HUMINT. DIA, defense, that's the measurements and signals. NSA, they do all of them put together, SIGINT. And then the one on the right, actually MINT now, the name has changed 3 or 4 times. It's really under the National Reconnaissance Office now. It's a separate office. Okay, next. Now, we talked a little bit about the COMET. This is what a typical COMET satellite is. That's to intercept any kind of radio, telemetry, going to a satellite, anybody talking on the telephone. If you're talking on your cell phone, we can hear it if we are allowed to by law. That's what the satellites look for. Those dishes now are probably 100 feet across. Yeah, they are huge. And they don't miss much. They are very, 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 very sensitive. And then you have roomfuls of Cray computers sorting out the signals on the ground. And that's why, if anybody's ever read the book, The Puzzle Palace, if you haven't, you can read that and get a good idea, at least 30 or 40 years ago, how all this worked and the amount of computing power that you need to do this. That's what that satellite looks like, kind of. Not really, but kind of. That gives you an idea on the comment. ELINT looks, quite a bit the same, except look at the thing. How many different sizes of dishes are there? A whole bunch, because we're interested in all these different frequency bands we talked about before. So if we want to intercept and analyze a frequency, we have to have a dish to do that. So this is what your ELINT satellite would look like. And that's what it tries to get. Radar signatures, infrared, identification systems, that's for airplanes and ships and things. Every country has a way they identify every single airplane. Where it's at, we try to figure that out. And we try to track their airplanes all the time, 24 hours a day, everybody's that we're interested in. And we even track noise and sound generation. And what's all the most fun a lot of times for people, and this is now under the National Reconnaissance Office, is image intelligence. This is what a typical visual image satellite, not infrared, not things, looks like. It's as big as a bus, as big as a school bus. It's got several antennas to communicate, some really interesting mirrors and lenses, and a huge amount of computing power. Now, and it can see things pretty well. The way you measure things you see is the separation of objects. And so if you have this object, and they're about 6 inches tall. If you have 6-inch resolution, can you see this object? Well, yeah, you can see them all this, but now can you see these objects? No. You can't see either one of these objects because they're closer than 6 inches together. Once objects get closer than your resolution together, they meld into one object. So you have, there's a lot of restrictions in there that people don't understand about this resolution, and you think how good these things are. You talk about reading license plates from space. Yeah, I don't think so. Now, I mean, we're pretty good, but... And then you see the movies all the time where they pick up the phone and say, I need an image over here, link me into the satellite so I can watch this guy walk into the building. No, not happening, okay? But look at this thing and think, now, its field of view, in order to get 6-inch resolution, has to be what? Small. It has to be small. So you have to be pointing right exactly at what you want to see and take a picture of, which means, can you see stuff if you don't know where it's at? No. You can't see anything if you don't know the exact location of where it's at. Can you see it if it's moving? No, because you don't know where it's at. You know where it was. You don't know where it's at. Now, you can take a picture out here if you're looking for, say, a movement of a line of tanks. You can find them if you have a pretty good idea because you take a picture, and how good a resolution now do you need? 10 feet. Yeah, now you need 10 feet resolution in order to separate the tanks, if that's what you're looking for. So now how big can your footprint be? 10 times as big, 20 times as big, 100 times as big. So then you can. So these are the differences in how you do this. Now, where does this thing point? Where we tell it to, right? It points where we tell it to, and when does it turn the camera on? When we tell it to. It doesn't run this thing all the time, because the amount of throughput to transmit a visual image digitally to the ground with that kind, yes. I mean, we're talking some electrons here in order to transmit that image. So you just don't keep it on like a movie camera and can't do it. Can't be done. So it's, you know, you see all these things about, oh, move it over here, take a picture over here. Nope. Not happening. Not doing it. Who gets to choose where this goes? Not the guys in NCIS. They don't get to choose where this thing looks. You know, so it's, the NRO is a group of, you know, all kinds of spooks and military guys and politicians and things, and they get together and they decide what's going to happen. Day, 2 days, 3 days in advance, they decide. And then daily, if you really need to move it, you better be somebody, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Vice President, somebody like that. You better be somebody if you're going to shift from this target to a new one, real time. They do that. Yes?
The satellite is not really telling you what's happening. It's verifying what you think is happening.
What you think is happening, but more often, what has happened.
Has happened.
Yeah, it's used for two things. It's used to find out what you think is happening, and you do that by taking a picture today and taking a picture 4 days from now. And you compare the two. And if you look at satellite imagery analysis, that's the most common thing. Oh, there was nothing here, now this is here. 5 days later, this is here. They are building a nuclear test facility here because we know what that building looks like and that building looks like from other ones we've seen. So you do that a lot. You try to figure out what they are doing by taking sequential pictures of a set place. Now, movement of troops and activity, that's a different story, and you can try to do that, but that's really hard to do with, there's other ways to do that, you know, not necessarily with your imaging satellite. It's almost impossible to be quiet and move. Almost impossible. It's almost impossible to move without transmitting somehow, without making any noise. Remember, we talked about the noise. Well, what kind of noise does a tank make? We know. So one of those dishes can tell you what's going on in that regard a lot of times. And then you say, oh my gosh, we've got noise over here. And you coordinate the two. And so there are other ways. So, but it's not nearly, I just want to say, you don't read the license plates in anybody's car. You don't watch 4 guys run into the shack and drag somebody out. That's not happening in this kind of satellite. Now, we can do that, but not with satellites. We can do that with drones and other systems. There are other systems that we can do that with, not with satellites. Okay? Next, please.
Are these about 600 miles?
Yeah, 300 to 600 miles. Yeah, yeah. You can move them up and down quite a bit on the thing. They have a set life where they're really expensive. You want to talk about an expensive piece of equipment? That's probably one of the most expensive things ever, is one of these visual imaging satellites. That's what a modern one looks like in person. Big. And, but you need to be low. You know, I mean, it's a direct square of the distance problem. Next, please. Here's some imagery that's, this is relatively new. This is from the Iranian missile launch facility that was attacked on the things. So this is only a couple years old. It's hard to find recent declassified imagery because they don't declassify it, because if you show the picture, you can figure out how good it is. Now, the other thing to remember about the satellites is because of the field of view, remember we talked about that in the orbit, how far it can see. Everybody that has satellites knows where everybody else's satellites orbit. They know those orbits. They've got them all plugged into their computers. They can tell you exactly where that thing's going to be tomorrow afternoon at 2:15. And so if they know that, can they also figure out what the footprint is? Yeah. If they know the footprint, can they stay outside it? Yeah. So that's what happens with satellites a lot. So what do you do satellites for? Fixed things, things that don't move. Missile sites, research facilities, headquarters, things that don't move. But you get pretty good resolution here in this. In this photo, you can see, now you have to remember, this is not the real resolution of this photo that you're seeing here. This is the declassified version of this photo. So this is not the real resolution of this photo. This is not the blown up view of this photo. This is not one looked at under a microscope. That's how you get 2-3 inch resolution, is when you have the real photo and the ability to blow it up. And you can blow it up digitally just like we can, you know, images, but that's not a good idea. You know, as soon as you start trying to blow images up digitally, you lose your resolution right away. And you actually hinder what you're trying to do by doing that. But that's pretty good resolution. If you think about it and looked at it and thought about how big some of those items are that you're looking at, and you're looking at this from 600 miles, and then at least double the resolution that you can see right now, that's pretty good imagery. This is another imagery taken in Iraq. No, I think this is Saudi Arabia. This is when they were attacked, and they attacked the oil processing facilities. They blamed it on Iran because of the direction of the impact of the munitions. But once again, those are oil storage tanks. And again, this is not the actual resolution. So you can see that you can see quite a bit of stuff. Next. This is a very, very common use for satellite imagery. You don't need excellent satellite imagery to do this, which is, are the ships in port or not in port? Are they in dry dock or not in dry dock? Are they putting new helicopters on that ship? You can tell all that from this image. So looking at naval assets with satellites is really good. Now, one of the hardest things to do ever, try to find a Navy ship in the ocean. I mean, what are you going to use? If they are good at their job, which means don't make any noise, don't transmit, finding them is really, really hard. And you can, you know, we have air carrier groups out there with 10 ships in it. You can't find them. We can't find them. It's hard. So, ocean's a big place. This is in Iraq. This was Iran who did this. And these are good pictures here. You can really get the small little images right here. Those are airplanes on the ramp, still individual airplanes on the ramp, which are, say, 40 feet long. So you've got a pretty good resolution there, or even in the one they're showing you. This is the attack that the Iranians did after we killed General, what's his name? We killed their top Revolutionary Guard commander with a drone strike, and 2 days later they did this. So, next. This is another thing that Dick asked me to talk a little bit about this. This is the space launch development proposals in Michigan. Okay, and there are actually 2 locations that they're doing, and the ones running with the football is this group here, Michigan Aerospace Manufacturers Association, and that's a group of a whole bunch of companies. And there's 2 main areas that they've looked at and they have announced, and one is about 16 miles north of Marquette, right on Lake Superior. And that's a vertical launch facility. And then the horizontal launch facility is in the old Wurtsmith Air Force Base facility in Oscoda. And it's, by horizontal launch, they mean the rocket is put on top of 747, flown up to 50,000 feet, kicked off the airplane, and then launches from there. That saves you 50% of your fuel weight that you need to get that rocket into orbit, if you can do that. So that's why you have a horizontal launch and a vertical launch thing. And these are their 2 sites that they've announced. Next slide.
Are other people doing horizontal launches? Is that
Yes.
a common technique?
Yeah, not common, but there are. We do them. Horizontal launches a lot of times are done for polar orbits, because and one of the reasons for these 2 locations is, and it'll come out a little bit in here, is the guy driving this train is Elon Musk. He's driving this in Michigan because he wants to get his autonomous cars everywhere in the world. And you can't do it with any system that we have of navigation out there now. They're not reliable enough, even GPS, because, and what happens is you got urban shadowing, which is essentially any built up area where, like in these walls, are close enough together that a satellite cannot get a signal down in between these 2 walls. So you lose the signal, like particularly in places like New York City, where they have extremely high things. Trying to get a space signal down to the street level is really, really hard. And so they launch polar satellites to fill in that area that you can't reach. And they went from 4,000, now this is where the 12,000 comes in. Remember we talked to Starlink, originally it was 4,000. Now they've upped it to 12,000 because they need that many to be able to drive autonomous cars anywhere in the world. So that's why they went to this higher number. Go ahead, Dick. Do you have a question? No. So it's...
I have a question, Rocky.
Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
Why would they choose to have launch places in northern Michigan where the weather is such an issue?
Yeah, as I was saying, the real reason you launch from up here is because launching into a polar orbit from here is much, much easier than launching into a polar orbit from Cape Canaveral. Because, you know, that extra flight time and launch time costs you an enormous amount of fuel. And if you start studying the mechanics of how you establish an orbit, getting something from down near the equator into a polar orbit requires an enormous amount of fuel on the satellite once you get it into orbit, because that's not its natural place. You see, you know, the European Space Agency launches out of Guyana because it's right on the equator. So they save a ton of money launching into geostationary. This is an attempt to find they will also launch from those locations because they will have satellites also, not geostationary, but also over the equatorial belt of the world. But this group need massive numbers of satellites over the polar regions and the upper Scandinavian regions, and it's much, much, much more cost effective to launch from up here.
So these orbit North Pole to South Pole.
Correct.
Now, are they geosynchronous also with Earth movement? Or
No, these don't have to be.
Earth moves.
No, it moves under them, but they are they're all interconnected, so that the signal is continuous, and so you don't. It's not like generating a signal that has to reach one specific point. As long as the signal is there, somebody can pick it up. And it's essentially generating a timing signal just like GPS. It's just going to transmit a timing signal so that you can find your location. Things. It's about 3 or 4 years out, according to their plans. Right now, this is a hybrid group of a public-private cooperative venture. What does that mean? That means these guys are the private. They want the public to pay for it. So what they're on the road now, going to Congress, going to the Michigan legislature, going to the governmental agencies that control space launch, and pleading their case to say, this makes really good sense, give us some money so we can do this. That's where they're at right now. They don't have the launch money to build the facility yet. They've been putting a lot of their own money in. They've put a ton of money into this. And this group of aerospace manufacturing people, that's the people who will support the launch and the people who will support the cars. It's a double group. You know, it also includes Ford, Chevy. They are members of this group because they want to build autonomous cars. And they need the guidance system in order to make it work. So that's what's happening. Okay, we talked about development, how they work, all those things. And finally, excuse me, Michigan issues. That's it. If there's questions, I'll take them now.
If you have questions, just unmute your microphone and ask the question, please.
Rocky, you may have addressed this and I missed it, but what do they do when the satellites are no longer functional or they need to be replaced? How do they get them out of the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't cover that. The low Earth orbit satellites, they just let the orbit decay and they burn up, coming back into the atmosphere.
Okay.
Except like the imaging reconnaissance satellite that's big as a bus and in low Earth orbit, they will move it into a higher orbit where it will stay for 50 years. And it goes into a trash orbit. That's all. When you see that space debris, a goodly number of that space debris are dead satellites that are just in trash orbits to keep them from coming back to Earth. But anything in low Earth orbit, they either let the satellite orbit decay or they cause the satellite orbit to decay. A lot of times they'll do that because then they can predict very accurately the impact zone. And so they'll, now that there was a big brouhaha here a couple of years ago because the Russians deorbited a satellite and it didn't go where it was supposed to go and ended up going into a populated area. And so there's always...
They don't ever send them out into the Netherlands, hey?
We do not really into the Netherlands, but all those geosynchronous satellites you see out there, all you do is move them up 1 or 2, 3 steps. It's not just 1 or 2 miles, but say 20 or 30 miles outside that orbit, and give them a little push, and then leave them, and they'll either break free or they'll stay up there for 300 years.
Oh. All right,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
You talked about service missions to the Hubble Telescope.
Yes.
Are service missions to some of these other satellites? Are they? Or not?
Yeah, Ron asked if there are other service missions to other satellites other than Hubble. It's almost one of the ones that I can neither confirm nor deny that there are service missions to other satellites.
Because of your position or because you don't know?
Does that answer your question, Ron?
Yes.
Okay.
I would imagine there's some economic or other particular interest in the satellite to justify doing that.
Yeah, what Ron asked is there's obviously some other interest, economic or otherwise, in having a service mission to other satellites. And what it really boils down to is that the low Earth orbiting satellites are typically not nearly as complex and not nearly as sustainable as the geostationary satellites. They're not those big buses like we saw, except for the imaging satellites and things like that, and they are. And so therefore, when you've got multi-billion dollars in your satellite, you'll tend to take care of it more than that. Yeah, Ron, one more.
Are these service missions done by other than just the space shuttle? I mean, are there
No,
private companies?
no. I mean, there are private people. You will see mission specialists that are placed on that are not government people at all, that are placed on that mission because they are the experts, and they're paid for their whole spot and their whole thing, and that whole mission is paid for by somebody else.
Rocky, occasionally you see the discussion of warfare amongst satellites pop up and things, or warfare.
Yeah, satellite warfare or anti-satellite,
right,
some things and all that. It's really hard to do all we're talking about either having one satellite attack another satellite or attacking a satellite from the ground with either a mechanical object or electronic means. Either could be lasers or other things. It's really hard to do that because you can't really sneak up on anybody. It's not like they don't know you're coming, that you're going to try to do this. And so it all boils down to maneuverability and anticipation. And so if you anticipate an attack, now if someone can launch 10 satellites versus one satellite, then life gets miserable really quick. If they had the ability to do something like that. 10 or 20 maneuvering satellites, like a shotgun blast. And each one independent of the other, the little ones. Then it would be very difficult. But they can't maneuver typically any faster or any better because they don't have the fuel supply. So, yeah.
And did you get your chat question answered about how high are the surveillance satellites?
Yeah. Yeah, I think she's gone. Yeah, anyway, I'll answer that. There was a question, how high are the surveillance satellites? And they vary from 300 to 600 miles, depending on which type of satellite and what missions they're doing. There are some that are as low as 100 miles that will, their mission is better served at the lowest altitude that we can keep them. So that doesn't mean they stay there, but
There's a lot of drag.
yeah, well, that doesn't mean they stay there, but there are times when you'll have an operational satellite at that altitude.
So why are the geosynchronous satellites 23,000 miles away? Is it a function of how far away?
Yeah, it's just a radius issue. That's you just put a string up there and you figure out that at what point is the speed of the orbit the same as the radius. Yeah, and so it's all about gravity and, because you're actually using, the gravity determines the orbit. On the thing, you're not, there's just not a, you're not in a tube up there. You have to continually work to stay in the orbit, which means you have to continually fight gravity. And that particular place is where gravity determines that your speed, which is determined by falling, the satellite is essentially falling all the time. 100% of its life, it's falling. It just doesn't move down. It's because you keep it where it's at. So it's falling, and that speed that it's falling at is the same as the rotational speed of the Earth. So these two things now are the same. And so therefore it apparently stays over the top of the same spot on the Earth because its falling speed, its orbit speed, is the same speed as the rotation of the Earth. And if you're lower, it's going to be faster. And if you're higher, it's going to be slower. So that's the only place where it works out that you're going to maintain your position right over one spot on the Earth.
Where does the atmosphere stop impeding satellites?
Probably about 100 miles. Yeah. It doesn't take much to impede these spacecraft. Yeah, it's, I mean, 100 miles is the definite, I think, still, I don't know if they've changed it. It used to be like the definition of space was at 100 miles, and that's where you run out of enough measurable atoms to call it atmosphere. That's why they picked 100 miles. So that's why that's probably what somebody would say. That doesn't mean you don't really want to be there because there's still stuff, still atoms and things, and it's
Any more questions from the folks out in Zoom land? Any questions from people in the real land? Okay. Thank you, Rocky. Another great presentation. Lots of interesting tidbits there. So with that, we will be signing off. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.